Well, good morning and happy Easter. So for thousands of years on this day, someone like me has stood in front of a gathered community like you and led them in a call and response. It goes like this: He is risen, and the response has always been, He is risen indeed. Let's try that again. Church, He is risen.
He is risen indeed.
And we are here today to bear witness to that truth. So we have in our Bibles 4 accounts of the life of Jesus. We call them Gospels, and each one is slightly different from the other. But there is one thing that you'll notice, if you were to map them all out, you'll notice something interesting, and that is that they all move fairly quickly through his ministry, almost like a blur, until they get to that final week of his life, and then everything slows down, and the details multiply. It's almost as if the Gospels are long introductions to the story of his death and his resurrection. Now, all 4 of those Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all tell the story of Easter. And most years on Easter, we gather together and we read either Luke or John's version of the story. They're a little bit longer. They are rich with details that are both beautiful and also endearing. But this year I thought we might read Matthew's version. It's a little bit shorter, a little more stripped down, but it contains 2 details that none of the other 3 Gospels have. And this morning, those details are going to be what I would like for us to look at together. Now, one thing that you will notice before we read is that Matthew tells us that only 2 women came to the tomb that morning. There were no other disciples. They were nowhere to be found. It was just Mary and the other Mary. The story of Easter is a testament to the strength of women. You see, they had been there on Friday. They were there when he was crucified. They witnessed his suffering. They watched him die. They stood there helplessly as it all happened. And so they came in the early morning darkness, not to prepare their body for burial like it is in the other Gospels, but they came just to see for themselves. What they had witnessed was so horrific, so gut-wrenching, that they had to come to see if it really was true. But what happened on that day, what they found when they came, it changed everything. Not just for them, but for all the world. So I invite you to hear that story now.
From the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 28, verses 1 through 10. After the Sabbath, as the first day of the week was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descending from heaven came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. For fear of him, the guards shook and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid. I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has been raised, as he said. Come, see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he has been raised from the dead, and indeed he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him. This is my message for him." So they left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them and said, "Greetings." And they came to him, took hold of his feet, and worshiped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
I really am glad that you were here today, even if you didn't really want to be. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand if you were here against your will this morning, but I'm well aware that there are some who have been told that if you want Easter brunch, you have to go to church. And I want you to know that I'm glad that you are here. It reminds me of a story of a boy dressed in his Easter best, and he's rummaging through his Easter basket, and he is protesting that he didn't want to go to church on that day. He says, I don't know why we have to go to church on Easter every year. They keep telling the same story. It always ends up good in the end, and I suppose that that's true, but either way, I'm glad that you were here. Years ago, when I was in seminary, I took a class on preaching, and there were several in the class that were debating how many points a good sermon should have. Good, honest debate, and finally somebody says, well, why don't we ask the professor? And so somebody asked the professor, how many points should a good sermon have? And she thought for a moment. And remember, this is somebody that had been hearing us preach over the course of a semester. And she looked at me out of the corner of her eye. She says, ideally, a sermon would have at least 1 point. And I think my professor was right. Ideally, a sermon does have at least 1 point. But this morning, I'm going to try for 2, and I promise that they're good ones. Because Matthew's version of the story has, as I said a moment ago, 2 details that none of the other Gospels have, and both of them have something important for us to look at today. Now, the story that you heard just a minute ago, it's a great story. The problem with the story is that it lacks a lot of details. Right? The Gospels, whichever one that you read, are far from clear on just what happened on that morning. Those stories are filled with meaning and truth, but when it comes to details of how this whole resurrection thing happens, there just isn't much there. But one thing that they all agree on is that Easter started in the dark. That Easter started in the dark. Did you hear how Matthew began his story? It was after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week was dawning. Easter begins in the dark. That's quite a phrase, isn't it? I think Matthew was not just telling us the time, he was also giving us an image. The dawn isn't just atmospheric backdrop. That's a theological statement. Night belongs to death, but dawn belongs to something else entirely. But Matthew doesn't let the dawn arrive quietly before anybody can catch their breath, and this is one of the details that's only in Matthew's gospel. Before anybody can catch their breath, the earth shakes. The world literally shook. Now, I've believed for a number of years that life begins when God gets your attention. That life begins when God gets your attention. Matthew certainly wants to make it clear that there is nothing subtle about Easter. Now, the word there in Greek for earthquake is seismos. It's where we get the word seismic. It's associated with earthquakes. And this was not the first time that Matthew used that word seismos. In fact, it happens 2 other times during the Passion story. The story of Jesus' final week is on that first Palm Sunday as they rode in, as Jesus makes his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. It says that when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was in turmoil. Turmoil. That word in Greek is seismos. He was saying that everything was being shaken up, that nobody knew what was happening, and I would argue that that's not a bad word for what's going on in the world around us. Globally, personally, that there's a lot of turmoil in the world. In a lot of ways, the world is in turmoil. I know a lot of people whose lives are in turmoil. Maybe they're dealing with addiction or a difficult diagnosis. Maybe the marriage is just barely hanging on. And for a lot of people, everything feels shaken up. Many are shook to the core. Seismos. The second time that word shows up is in Matthew 27 when Jesus dies. In the very moment that Jesus breathes his last breath, it says, at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split. Seismos. The earth shook. I think that that was Matthew's way of saying that things were falling apart, that everything was changing. Now, those of you who are English majors or maybe movie makers will point to that and to say that that was a foreshadowing of what was going to happen later in the story, of what was to come, and that Matthew was preparing us for what was about to happen. And sure enough, on that first Easter morning, as the two Marys went to the tomb, suddenly there was a great earthquake. Now, I grew up in Northern California. I've been through my share of earthquakes. And here's what you need to know is that most of them you don't even feel. 9 out of 10, you just sleep through them or barely notice them at all. But every once in a while, some of them get your attention. Some really shake things up. Back in 1989, there was the Loma Prieta earthquake. Some of you may remember that was the one that took place right in the middle, right before the World Series game started and the Bay Bridge crashed in. Now, that was 1989. I was a student at TCU across the street, so I wasn't there to experience it. But I have friends back in Northern California, friends and family that experienced it and still talk about it to this day, about where they were, about what it was like, about how it felt. My mom happened to be at the grocery store when it happened, and she was writing a check in the checkout line. Do you guys remember checks? Do you remember? If you don't know what a check is, ask your grandparents later today. They will tell you what a check is. Well, my mom was looking down, writing a check. She was about 50 at the time, and all of a sudden, everything starts moving, and she thought to herself, oh my God, I'm having a hot flash. And then she looks up, and everybody's moving. She says, we're all having hot flashes. That certainly got everybody's attention. Earthquakes sometimes have a way of doing that. Now, let me just say this, that I believe that God gets our attention in all sorts of different ways. And sometimes it's sudden and dramatic, like a flash of lightning, a moment of blinding clarity that stops you right in the middle of your tracks. But sometimes God gets our attention in a quiet way, almost subtly. Like God sneaks up on you, a slow dawning like this Easter morning, where something shifts deep inside of you that you can't quite explain. Sometimes God breaks in with peace and serenity, a stillness that has no business being there given what you're going through in life. There are many here this morning for whom life is good and full. And for that, I am thankful and I celebrate with you. But I'm also keenly aware that for others of you that God has been getting your attention right in the midst of something horrible and much harder. Through loss, through failure, through a diagnosis, through a relationship that's falling apart, a dream that hasn't survived. And in the middle of all that, you have some questions. You have some questions, deep ones, in fact, honest ones. Questions that won't be satisfied by bumper sticker theology or religious small talk. And if that's you, I want to encourage you to bring your questions here and to lay them at the foot of the empty tomb. Because if your life is in the middle of seismos right now, if the ground beneath you is shaking, if nothing feels solid, here's what Easter has to tell you, and that is that this is not the end of your story. Easter reminds us that pain is not the final word, that death and darkness, they don't get the last say. You see, Easter reminds us that God has been making beauty out of chaos, peace out of turmoil since the very beginning, and God's not about to stop now. You see, life has a way of beginning right in the middle of an earthquake when everything that we thought was solid gets shaken loose. And we finally get quiet enough to hear what God has been trying to tell us all along. So that's the first thing that Matthew gives us that the others don't, and that's that the earth shook. But there's a second detail that always jumps out at me, and this one comes a little bit later in the story. Now, the section of the story that we read this morning, it ended with the risen Jesus encountering the women and telling them not to be afraid, and then telling them to go tell the other disciples to go to Galilee. To go to Galilee, and that's where they will be able to see Jesus for themselves. And that's what happened. The disciples, they go back to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus told them to go. And it says this, it says, when they saw him, they worshiped him. But some doubted, it says. But some doubted. You see, friends, on that very first Easter, even the disciples doubted. Even the disciples had doubts. So if Easter is a story that welcomes our doubts and our questions, what if Easter really is one of those stories that welcomes all that we might ask? And so if you're here this morning, if you're listening online, and you have doubts, if you come wondering how this can be true, know that you're not alone, that you are in good company, that even the disciples, the ones that had been with him for years, watched him do miracles, watched him heal people, raise people from the dead, even they had doubts. And notice, too, that Jesus doesn't rebuke them. He doesn't correct them. He doesn't ask them to get their act together before he commissions them to go out into the world. He just moves forward and includes them anyway, right in the midst of their questions. So maybe you've walked away from faith. Maybe you never had it to begin with. And maybe for you, the questions have always outweighed the answers, that church never felt like a good, safe place for someone like you. And if that's you, I want you to know that I'm talking to you right now. You see, there are churches that will tell you that if you have doubts, that you are somehow disqualified, that your faith just isn't strong enough. There are churches that will tell you that, but this isn't one of them. This is a church that is an open-hearted church for curious-minded people. This is a church that leaves room for doubt. In fact, we go so far as to say that doubt is not the opposite of faith. Certainty is the opposite of faith. Think about it. If you were certain, you don't need faith. That's why they call it faith. Faith is what you have when you don't have certainty, and yet you choose to trust anyway. You see, I would argue that doubt isn't a sign that you're losing your faith. It might be a sign that your faith is actually alive. Faith is not just what you believe. It's about the questions you are courageous enough to ask. And let me also just say that a God that can't handle your questions, that can't handle your doubts, probably isn't worth believing in anyway. But somewhere along the way, for a lot of people, Christianity has become this package of belief that you're just handed at birth, and it's not to be questioned, it's not to be examined, just accepted. And if you can't sign on the dotted line for every single item on that list, well, then somehow you're out. The expectation in some churches is that you just check your brain at the door. So no wonder so many people walk away. You know, I've been doing this a long time. And people still ask me from time to time, do you really believe this? Russ, you seem like a smart guy. Do you really believe that Jesus rose from the dead? My answer is always the same. I don't just believe it. I'm counting on it. I am building my life around it. I am counting on the fact that the earthquake doesn't have the last word, that dawn always follows the darkness, that this is not the end of the story. It wasn't for Jesus, and it's not for us. I'm counting on a God who walks with us through the worst of what life throws at us and does not let us go. A God who meets us in our doubt and moves forward with us anyway. I am counting on the fact that hate and sickness and death, as real and as brutal as they are, that they don't get the final say. And I'm counting on this, that the life that Easter offered doesn't begin when you die. It begins now. Right now, even here, even you. And that's not certainty, that's faith, and maybe that's enough for a day like today. You see, Frederick Buechner once wrote that whether the resurrection is true or not, one thing is certain, and that is that for believers and unbelievers alike, that life has never been the same. And so maybe you came here this morning in the dark, carrying grief or doubt or just the weight of a life that hasn't gone the way that you thought that it should. Maybe you came because someone made you. Maybe you came because something inside of you just needed to. But here's what I know about dawn, and that is that it comes whether you are ready for it or not. That you don't have to understand it, you don't have to have it all figured out. That the light comes anyway. You see, the women came to that tomb in darkness, and the earth shook, and the morning broke, and nothing was the same ever again. And that's the story. As fragmented, as shadowy, as incomplete as life itself. And yet, somehow, stubbornly, magnificently true. So, church, know this, that from this day forward, death does not get the last word, because dawn has come. He is risen.